Hi, welcome to Quilting with Lori. My name is Lori Dickman, and today I'm going to be sharing with you part one of the log cabin on point. And there is a PDF below in the description box. You'll definitely want to either print that out or save it so that you'll have access to it. It gives you an overview of what we're going to be doing and how we're going to put this quilt together. I have some of it started. It's just laying on the design wall behind me. I do want to point out that the blocks I have laying here are on a white design wall. That's a flannel design wall, and that design wall is leaning up against another quilt. So everything that you see around there is another quilt that's behind there, the black border. So don't get confused about what you're actually looking at. But what's kind of fun is if you look at this log cabin on point, these are the blocks that I've currently finished. And I've just placed them there. They're not sewn in with the sashing. They're just laying on the design wall. But it is in the shape of a heart, and I thought that was pretty appropriate for Valentine's Day coming along pretty soon. But I'm going to show you today, number one, what fabrics to use or how to use your fabric stash or jelly rolls if you have jelly rolls that you've purchased and want to use. I'm going to show you some layouts. The layout that you see here is the jelly roll, or excuse me, the log cabin on point, but I'm going to do something different, and I'm going to show you that. So today what I want to discuss and share with you is, in part one of this log cabin quilt, is fabric selection and block construction. So if you pull your PDF, you'll see what I'm referring to. We're going to be needing for each block, for all of the blocks, if you're going to make the 92 by 92 inch size, which is what I'm doing, you're going to need a total of 7 yards of various fabrics to be able to construct that. Or if you plan to use purchased jelly rolls, you're going to want 4 of those jelly rolls to be able to make the 92 by 92 inch quilt. You'll also need some borders and sashing fabric. For the sashing and inside border, you're going to need 2 1/4 yards, and for the outside border, you're going to need 1 3/4 yard. And if you look at your PDF, you'll see that it's showing navy blue. I am actually going to be using navy sashing in mine, and I auditioned that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But the goal for this quilt for me is to use up my scraps. I have a ton of 2 1/2 inch strips that I have been cutting as I've been cutting and sorting my stash, and I want to use them. I have containers of darks and mediums and lights, and that's my goal. So I'm going to use my scrap stash of strips, 2 1/2 inch strips, to create these blocks. So let's say you're not interested in making a really large quilt. You certainly don't have to. You can make any size quilt using this pattern. In fact, if you're interested in the design right here on the wall, there are just 8 blocks that I've created with some sashing, and it's all just laying on the design wall. It's not pieced together, so it's not completely even. But what a fun Valentine quilt this would make if you were to use some beautiful pinks and reds or whatever colors you choose in your theme for your home to make that, and then put some corner squares on it. How fun that would be. So now let's take a look at how this block goes together and the fabrics that I've chosen and how I've cut them. And we'll go to the tabletop to see that. So here is one of the blocks that I have finished here. They are 12 1/2 inches. They get squared up to 12 1/2 inches. And the information on your PDF will give you the details on that. You do want to pull, you'll start with 2 1/2 inch squares. And so that's what I've started with here. So I have 2 2 1/2 inch squares. I have 2 4 1/2 inch subcut strips from the 2 1/2 inch strips. I have 2 6 1/2, 2 8 1/2, 2 10 1/2, and 1 12 1/2. And these were all subcut from my 2 1/2 inch strips. Let me show you how I did that. So here are the 2 containers that I'm using as I subcut all of my 2 1/2 inch strips into the 2 1/2, 4 1/2, 6 1/2, 8 1/2, 10 1/2, and 12 1/2 inch sections. I place them in here. So I have lights as well as the mediums and darks for each of the squares. And my color selection, basically it started with these squares. In my 2 1/2 inch container of squares, I had a lot of these, and I decided I wanted to use them, and I'm going to incorporate them into this quilt. As you can see, I've got the bright yellow there, and then I have a light yellow here, and I found a fat quarter from which I cut all of those. So those are the two squares that will be in each and every quilt block that I'm putting together. That's something that will help the eye. It'll be a resting place for the eye, a landing place that gives some uniformity to the quilt. Now, when I put the quilt block together, you'll see I started with these two, the light and the bright yellow. So they were the first two that were put together. The lights on my block are on this side of the block, and the brights are on this side of the block. And so every single block that I'm creating, I'm making sure that I'm doing it uniformly so that all of the lights are on this side and brights on this side. You might flip yours around, that's fine, but just make sure that every block is uniform as you put it together. So you're going to be using two 2.5-inch squares. You're going to be using two 4.5-inch rectangles, two 6.5-inch rectangles, two 8.5-inch rectangles, two 10.5-inch rectangles, and just this one 12.5-inch rectangle. Now, in the case of my block, I have my lights on this side, so I needed to make sure that the 12.5-inch strips that I cut were all lights, because this is my light side. If you flip yours around, then, and if you have your bright colors over here, then of course your 12.5-inch strip, that last strip, is going to have to be a bright. So just keep that in mind as you're cutting, but otherwise you're cutting two of everything except for this last 12.5-inch section as you put it together. And I'm going to show you the block construction here in just a moment. As you can see, I'm using scraps, and I'm sort of keeping to the lighter section down here, and then I'm going brighter. But that isn't always the case. You'll see as you look at some of the blocks, they don't necessarily follow that value from light to dark. And I'm not really too concerned about that. It's a scrappy quilt, and I just want to use my scraps. And the yellows here, as well as the sashing, are going to give my quilt some uniformity, that landing place for the eye, that resting place, which will really make it a beautiful quilt. So I've gone ahead and got all of my strips subcut into the sizes that I needed, and then I simply laid them out next to my sewing machine to start cutting. One thing you want to keep in mind with the log cabin on point, it's basically a quarter of a log cabin block. When you're putting this together, you are not sewing all the way around the corner itself. You're just sewing on the sides, up the sides. If you were doing a typical log cabin quilt, you'd be starting with your square in the center, and you'd literally be sewing logs all the way around it. That's not what you're doing for this block. So make sure as you sew your log cabin block on point that you're starting down here, and then you're simply sewing these to these two edges to create the block. This is a 12.5-inch block. It will finish 12 inches in the quilt. It's going to be a nice big quilt. I'm excited to get this done. Now here is another option for you. Again, I've started with two 2.5-inch squares here, but I'm using the same colors on each side. And so that's another option for you if you'd like something that has a little bit more uniformity on both sides of the block. That's fun. You might want to try that. I would recommend auditioning some of your strips. If you don't want to sew them together and see what they look like, you could certainly audition them on the design wall and just decide, what do I like best, and then go from that point. I also want to play with some of these blocks on the wall and show you what you can do for a layout. There's so many different ways to lay out your quilt. I would recommend, once you've finished your blocks, I don't know that I would sew them together until after you've had a chance to really play with them, either on a design wall or on the floor if you don't have a big enough design wall, and just see what layout you like the best for your quilt. So let me show you some ideas here. So as I mentioned, you could certainly use this layout right here. Everything is on point, and by that I mean the points are at the bottom, with the yellows, those yellow squares are down at the bottom. So every single block is laid on the wall in the same orientation. Now let's say you're not so keen on this orientation. Maybe you want to change that up a bit. Let's see what we can do. I might want to create sort of a pinwheel effect here. It's not going to be perfectly even, but you'll get the idea, I think, once I have it. All right. So if you look at this, what you're seeing right in here is a square of color, and I kind of like that. And when I go over here and identify, let's see, I think that I would start doing that. Then you're going to get more squares of color. There's another square of color right there. Excuse me, it's a square of lights is what you're seeing over here, and a square of color over here. I kind of like that. In fact, I might do my quilt by laying out my blocks in this fashion instead of putting them all on point. I did have to make one more change to a block. This block here I had to switch so that you truly did see the square of the neutral shades there. And I really kind of like that. And the reason I like that is because I love to have fun on my long arm quilting and do some beautiful feathers. And I'm picturing all kinds of fun things that I could quilt in those spots, beautiful motifs and so forth. So that's why I'm leaning toward this design. But either design is wonderful, and there's so many other ways that you could play with this. And basically what I just want to make sure that you're aware of is before you sew it all together, play around, have fun with it, see what different designs you can come up with and which one you like the best. Audition it all. I have also auditioned the sashing in here. So I have some navy blue sashing that I've just laid in there. I've also taken the yellow squares, and these are the light squares, and I am planning on putting those as the cornerstones here with all the sashing. So that is my goal throughout the whole quilt. And then I'll have a navy blue on the inside border, and I'm not sure yet what I'll use for my outside border. I'll audition that once I get to that point. So now I am going to put the block together, and I have one just laid out here next to my sewing machine. I have my two light squares down here, the 2.5-inch squares. I have the 4.5-inch rectangle, 6.5, 8.5, 10.5, and my 12.5. And I'm going to put them together starting with the 2.5. And just be careful as you're putting things together that you're placing them on the correct side. So the first thing I'm going to do is start with these, and I'm going to place the bright on top of the light, right sides together. And I'm going to sew this. And as I work through this, I'm simply going to finger press today so that you'll see how I'm pressing my seam. So I fingered pressed that one toward the bright. And I want to make sure that you see my sewing. I'll make sure I move the camera here in just a second. The next thing I'm going to do, I laid it down on the table again. Now I'm going to sew this 4.5-inch strip to this, right sides together. Let me bring my machine up so you can see what I'm doing here. There we go. All right, now I'm sewing the 4.5-inch light strip to the two squares. And I am simply going to finger press that strip that I just sewed on with the fabric going toward that strip. So there is the 4.5-inch square. As you're sewing yours, I would make sure that you square them up as you're going through. This would need to be squared up to 4.5 inches and make sure that it's accurate. And then the next set would be 6.5, 8.5, 10.5, and then of course 12.5. By doing that as you're going, you're going to be much more happy with your blocks because they're going to end up being nice and square for you. All right, so the next thing we're going to do, I'm laying it down. I'm making sure that I'm going to sew this from this side on to that. So there we go. Here onto that. And this is what I'm going to do the whole way. I'm just constantly just sewing on these two sides. I'm going to finger press that open. There we go. I'm going to lay this down and find the light. Always make sure that you lay your finished piece down properly on the table, and then find the next light and put it on there. I like to lay out my pieces like this especially if I'm listening to music or watching TV or even just daydreaming, I won't get myself messed up and have my block go together incorrectly. If I just have it all laid out, every single block laying out right next to me, just as it's supposed to be sewn together, I'm much more pleased with the having not to do a lot of ripping at the end. So here is the block at 6.5 inches. So you should square this up at 6.5 inches to make sure that it's perfectly square. I'm not going to take the time right now to do that. I want you to see how this is done. All right, here's another 6.5 inch strip that needs to go on this side, and make sure that all your brights are on this side and that your lights are on that side. Here we go. So there's that. Now we're going to start with the 8.5 inch. And so I'm going to go ahead and sew the rest of these. I'll do that in fast motion. I don't think you need to see each step as slow as I've been going here, but this gives you a good idea. Each time I sew up another log to the unit, I bring it down to the table. I make sure that everything is positioned properly, and then I put the correct piece, the correct log onto the unit, depending on if it's the top or on the side. And in this case, it obviously has to be this log right here. So I'll go ahead and do this in fast motion for the rest of it, and I'll be right back. All right, so I have finished the block. Here it is. I do still need to get it pressed and squared up to 12.5 inches, but it turned out really well, and they go together so quickly. One fun thing about this quilt is that since it goes together so quickly and the blocks are so big, this very large quilt is going to be a project that we can do fairly quickly. So what I'm going to be doing over the next week and a half is putting together all the blocks that I'm going to need for my quilt. And then on part 2, I'm going to be talking to you more about sashing and the setting triangles and the setting corners that we're going to be putting together. You might choose to actually use the log cabin as part of your setting corners and setting triangles. They might end up looking like this, or like this, or like that, or like that. It just depends on where the setting triangle lands on the quilt itself. And we'll talk all about that in part 2, how you make it, how you cut it and place it in there. Or maybe you just rather use plain fabric. That's another option. I'll show you how to do those setting triangles and setting corners as well. And then of course we'll have our borders to do too. So I will see you back in part 2 for this log cabin on point in a week or two when I have all of my blocks put together. See you then. Happy quilting. And just a quick PS at the end here of the tutorial. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and comment. I love to read comments from my viewers. And please share my tutorials, my videos with your friends, with other quilters, with your quilt guilds. I'm really trying to grow my channel, and I want other quilters to be aware of it so that they too can use their scrap stash to make beautiful quilts. So hopefully you'll have fun sharing and maybe participating with friends as you're making this quilt. It's a wonderful quilt, and all of my scrappy tutorials I think are great ways to be able to use up your scrap stash to make beautiful quilts.